So August 16, 1960, a letter came to a mailbox outside of Philadelphia. And that letter was addressed to Roger Woodard. So Roger Woodard lived in this neighborhood that was rated C by the Hope maps. So this is a kind of redlined area, predominantly white, but middling. Nothing. It wasn't a high-end neighborhood. Roger was a black man. Obviously, he moved into this neighborhood. You saw neighbors start to move away, and threats of violence immediately start. The letter that he got told him to vacate the neighborhood. So over the course of 2 weeks, Roger bought this house on August 1st, give or take. And by August 14th, they tried to burn his house down twice, put a cross in his yard, and sent him multiple letters similar to the one you see here. Now, obviously, the grammar isn't the best, so the racist, well, sucks, I guess. But the point is that this was a constant consideration in this place. This middle one says "Coon goodbye," and also again, all of his windows were bashed out numerous times over 2 weeks. This was my great grandfather. My great grandfather lived outside of Philadelphia, and after this happened, my grandmother and her siblings moved into Trenton, New Jersey. I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey because of a certain set of situations that were propagated in this area that moved me from being from Philadelphia into being from Trenton, New Jersey. Small things like this shape us every single day. This is not so small, but this is a thing that I didn't even know shaped me until much later in my life, right? So what is design justice? Again, we are design justice practice. So design justice calls us to do a couple things. We believe that design justice, for nearly every injustice in the world, there is an architecture, a plan, a design that sustains that injustice. It requires us to challenge the privilege and power structures that use architecture and design as a tool of oppression. It requires us to forward a radically liberatory vision of racial, social, and cultural reparation, both through the process and outcomes of design. Now, when I say radical, who knows what the etymology of radical is? This can be interactive. This will be the couple seconds. Got it? Got it. Radish. Radish, right? So oftentimes when we hear the word radical, we talk about the extremes. But a radish is a root ball. It's going down. It's looking to get deeper. So when I ask you to be radical, my ask is that we get deeper, we have more knowledge before we make decisions about people's lives, right? When I think about process and outcomes, it's not enough for us just to have a beautiful building. It requires us to have a process that aligns with that beauty, right? A process that acknowledges the kind of cultural reverence or the cultural relevance of place. There's a quote by Paul Allen that says, "The loss of memory is the root of all oppression." The loss of memory is the root of all oppression. And so our statement is that the only thing that can stop that is a relentless pursuit of design of spaces of cultural memory is the foundation of a truthful and joyful collective existence. So that's what design justice is trying to do. That's the type of work we attempt to put out into the world. And I'll show you a little bit about that process and what that looks like for us. Okay. So I'm going to give you a few definitions to start, just to kind of give you some rounding what this is and what we start to consider. And then we'll talk a little bit about the context. When we talk about design justice, we're talking about kind of core areas of action. We deal with power. The history of all revolutions is based in blood and land. This is a quote by Malcolm X. We're talking about the landless versus the landlord. We're always talking about a power dynamic when we talk about what we build in space. And so acknowledging that early and understanding that it will determine how you interact with the communities that you are designing for is relevant. So in that power, we're looking at a lot of the isms and the is. So you can acknowledge that the systems of power rely on conscious or unconscious biases, and that's how it is sustained. It allows for a system to bear the load of the oppression. So it allows those who are operating the system to relieve themselves of the empathy required to build in place and space, right? I don't have to care because the rules told me I have to do it this way. So it's out of my hands. I have to tear down your house, and I've got to put up this house. Sorry, right? So power is really about that. So when we think about what goes away, what is, what isn't, we're talking about the system, the isms, sexism, ableism, racism, and we're talking about the people who operate those systems. Our interests in this particular environment, in this particular work, are the isms. People can call me a name all they want, but the systems provide much more damage to myself, my community, than anything else. Communities. So there's a difference between neighborhoods and communities. And I want to make sure that is very clear up front. Neighborhoods are the boundaries that shape a community. Communities themselves are the kind of spirit, the soul of place. It allows for the shared histories and rituals and patterns to be elevated in place. And so we want to acknowledge that communities are not the same. There is no community. So if you go into a place, there isn't one community. You'll often hear people, especially those who end up doing community engagement or community work, they'll say, go talk to the community and tell me what the community says. But everyone in this room is made up of multiple communities, right? We exist in ourselves as multiple communities. And so the reliance on a singular community often negates the voices of so many other people that want to be involved in that process. So acknowledging that communities and neighborhoods have a different look is incredibly important in design justice work. Values. Our values are validated through the spaces and places that we design. So the interests, the values that we hold individually get projected into the work that we do, whether we like it or not, right? And when I say we, the collective we, right? The things that we value. So in the 60s and 70s, we saw an uptick in prisons being built. Well, the fact that prisons were built at that rate in the 70s was in large part because a Southern strategy that wanted to kind of criminalize drug use, and they put a ton of people into these spaces. So you only build prisons because the value that we had at the time was that there were certain people that deserved to be more criminalized than others, right? So you gotta put them in place, right? You only have neighborhoods that get destroyed or demolished as a byproduct of highways and roads cutting through because the values were that we don't want to see or feel or be involved in these spaces. We want to bypass them. We want to get to where we're going in the suburbs or outside of the city. The only reason suburbs exist is because the economic viability of living in a city got pushed out beyond the boundaries of the urban environment. And so you had to find ways to get there, right? So our values start to align with that. These are the kind of principles and values that we hold in our practice. But first and foremost, we talk about the principles of process, honor the griot. Who knows what a griot is? Come on. Huh? Yeah, whatever. I mean, yeah.
Like the person who is radical in some ways.
Yeah.
Different.
Yeah. Holds stories. Yeah. Holds the stories. Holds the stories of the people. And really what that is the folks who can hold narratives and stories that may not feel like the absolute truth, but feel like the overall, give people the overall sense of place. People do it through song, people do it through poetry. So griots hold the story of people. And so I used to my grandmother, before she passed, she used to sit on the couch the corner of Cleveland and Trenton, New Jersey, and she would smoke a cigarette and she would just watch everybody who walked the street. When we were younger, she knew everybody. So the Miss Ellens of the block, the Miss Marys of the block, these are the people who knew every story of every child who walked over every crack on the sidewalk in this neighborhood. They know it all. And so for us to ignore or divert the value in their knowledge is a severe mistake. Okay, I'll power through a couple of these. Land is liberation. Let's just acknowledge that what we do with the land that we're working on has so many implications for people. And the more that we can make people free by way of the work that we do, whatever free means to them, is self-determination. Building power in place. There is nothing more powerful than working and pulling people together to build something together. Nothing. And so recognize that we get a chance to build something extreme like this, any bit of architecture, it allows us to organize around place, right? Culture's evolution, culture's revolution, it just really means that culture takes a lot of time. It's the result of a lot of patterns and rituals and habits that get formed and crystallized in a collective memory. But it can also be revolution. We saw a few years ago, in an instant, we saw protests erupt across the country. We saw that mode was one that changed how we started to do things, right? I don't know that it stuck, obviously, 3 years later, but that was part of the implications. So part of the theory and design that we kind of work with, from the principle side of the values that we hold, we're committing to being radical in design, we're thinking deeper, we're imagining just futures. What does it look like for us to impose a just future on a present condition? Can we recognize that form follows fiction, especially in communities of color? Oftentimes because we're not given the capacity or ability to hold on to property or to hold on to land in the same way that others are. Doesn't mean we don't have it, but it means that our histories often get wiped out or bulldozed or moved on to the next thing, right? And so the stories that we tell about place are every bit as valuable from a preservationist standpoint than as the building that gets held up for any other reason, right? And the design is process. So design is process. All we're really talking about, to protest is to have an unyielding faith in the power and potential of a just society. It is about our collective hope for what a future might look like that is just, that is liberated, that is joyful. And design can do that. Design is fundamentally a protest to a given environment. That this thing was not suitable or working for a community or a place or people, and we are going to design something new. Now, whether or not that is good or bad, or what the architecture is and how the architecture responds to that, is entirely up to you. But I encourage you to think about it through the lens of protest. Care is the last one. Actually, there's two more. Design justice is what love looks like in public spaces. This is a cribbing from Cornell West. Justice is what love looks like in public spaces. Spatial design must be a deep expression of a beloved community. So when I talk about that, especially when we talk about community design and community architecture, we're talking about the fact that if you want to create a space that of care, you have to be a part of that beloved community, right? You can't just go in, research, extract, and then come back out, right? And so if you are not going to be a part of that beloved community, then you hire people who are, and you let them have a voice. You don't let them, they already have a voice, right? You make sure that it's incorporated into the work. That's your job, to train them. All right, top level, and I know a lot of this stuff is just kind of grounding foundation for you, but status quo deliberation. A lot of times we work on things that we don't understand from an equitable standpoint, an equity standpoint, justice and liberation. Our work tends to lean into equity, justice, and liberation, depending on the project, depending on the client. But oftentimes we are seeking to move from the status quo of not challenging or not changing any given system to making fair in the present, to repair for past injustices, to influence or remove barriers to progress, and ultimately to affirmatively influence the future outcomes of communities that have been damaged by way of our spaces and places. Yeah. And so we're seeking to get to liberation. Again, that doesn't always happen, but it almost never happens, honestly, but that's what we're aiming for. And then culture. So culture is the consequence of persistent circumstance and immediate condition. It is the consequence or the result of a collective history of ritual and pattern, right? My grandmother did a certain thing a certain way. And so my mother did a thing a certain way. And so I do a thing a certain way, right? So we build a culture that allows us to survive based on the conditions around us. The culture has a seed to it. It's not just the end result, the beauty of the end result. So oftentimes I point to, how many people have been to New Orleans? Anybody? Okay. New Orleans has a beautiful, beautiful ritual called the second. Anybody know what the second line? Yes. Okay, so just for those of you who don't know, celebration of life and death is a means for us to parade around the streets in New Orleans 32 Sundays out of the year. There's about 500 to 1,000 people who stand behind a band that is playing brass instruments, and we walk through the streets. We dance through the streets. It's a beautiful, beautiful event, right? Every Sunday we can do that almost. But the reason that we needed second lines in the first place is because we couldn't bury our dead in cemeteries in the city. We had to walk outside of the city, right? We couldn't bury the dead. That's why we had to walk. And when you have to walk for miles, you're not just going to do it somberly, right? You got to figure out something else to do. And so you honor the dead. You laugh, you sing, you joyfully praise that person, right? In the 60s, insurance wouldn't give us the money to bury our dead. And so then we had to continue to do it, to raise money to be able to bury our dead on our own, right? So the necessity of a second line is the result of the policies and procedures that impacted us beforehand. All right, so all of this is to say that a biased power applied to communities shapes the collective memory and the culture of the place. In order to be anti-racist, to seek design justice, and to have a liberatory praxis, we're looking to do these four things at least. We are challenging power, deconstructing and constructing systems. We are respecting cultures by lifting narratives and acknowledging them. We are projecting our values, our collective values, not necessarily our individual values, but our collective values into the spaces and places that we're designing. And then we are demonstrating care, accountability, and mutual aid through our work together. So what does that look like? I'm going to show you some things that are small scale to large scale, and what were some of the processes that got us where we ended up. This is a project called Lights Out. This is a ephemeral project. We do a lot of things that are art-based, public art-based, and then we do the kind of standard typical architectural work on the other end of the spectrum. But this is a way for us to organize. So that thing I just told you about second lines, we held a series of second lines for the spaces that were dying in our neighborhoods. So instead of a body, we went from building to building to celebrate, to tell the stories of the people who were in those spaces, real or imagined, and to lift up the stories of our neighborhoods, right? And so we did this every Saturday for about 10 months. And we did teach-ins associated with this as well. So we taught people what it meant to again, challenge the systems that essentially allowed this to kind of continue to happen, right? In New Orleans, after Katrina, there were 50,000 homes that were unavailable to the market. That got down to about 25,000 about 5 or 6 years ago. But we still have about 20,000 homes that are still not on the market after Katrina. It's a ton of homes, right? part of that is because a policy shift of adjudicating past property means that we can't get properties into other hands. So this was an activity, engagement, kind of collective engagement that we did. This is another one. There was a gassing of a bunch of protesters in Philadelphia during 2020. And because we wanted to kind of build something that was physical, that they could carry during protests, and also collectively build to kind of create some space between the police and them. And so they use these signs in protests earlier in the day to basically create a little bit of space so that they weren't being directly attacked. They also had something to block any aerosol spray if that happened. This was the second time they were out protesting for this. No one got sprayed, so they didn't have to use it in that particular manner, but that's the purpose of these signs. And so this is an organized protest round. This is a little bit larger scale. So moving from the ephemeral, where these things can kind of go up in a day and move, to something a little bit more dynamic. This is a project called Paper Monuments. So Paper Monuments, in 2015, 16, 17, you started to see a lot of people talk about the removal of racist monuments or Confederate monuments across the South and across the nation. A big part of that was how do we reinterpret and envision spaces that are truthful to place. Most of the monuments that were put in place in the early 20th century were from the Daughters of the Confederacy, and they were also they were essentially Sears monuments. They were essentially bought from Connecticut. It was the same person standing the same way. They would change the belt out, or they would change the icon on the hat, and that's it. It was the same thing. So when you saw a few years ago people toppling those monuments and they would just crush like a can, remember that? That's because they were made for 100 years ago. So what we wanted to do is imagine what new monuments might look like to a place like New Orleans. So we told stories, and I pulled these three up for a reason, so I want to move through it, but I want to tell you these three stories because they are all specific to place. The middle here is Dorothy Mae Taylor. Dorothy Mae Taylor was a councilwoman in New Orleans who helped to desegregate Mardi Gras. You want to tell me when that happened? Take a guess. When did she desegregate Mardi Gras? You're going to hate the answer.
Last year.
Close. 1996. Yeah. 1996. Mardi Gras officially got desegregation. Which is a weird thing to say out loud. And really what that meant is that the crews and the floats were not, were segregated, fully segregated. And so we posted these out in the world, and we talk about small impacts, especially again in communities of color. We're talking about small impacts that can build trust, that allow us to build bigger things down the line. Her family found these posters. They made T-shirts. They go to City Hall to this day wearing their mother's face in the council room with this T-shirt on. This is the designer standoff. In 1970, September 15, 1970, we saw a standoff between the Black Panthers and 200 police out of Louisiana. They shot about 400 bullets through the home. Luckily, no one was hurt. And they tried to do it 2 other times. They eventually were able to kind of bulldoze the house. They brought 2 tanks to the house. But this was a way for us to kind of talk about this space that was so sacred, that was doing all the things that you think of when you think about the Black Panthers. They were feeding young people. They were supporting work release and jobs programs, so on and so forth. And this was a conversation about how the highway cut through the middle of the Tremaine, the oldest African-American neighborhood in the country, and essentially lost 400 businesses, 400 live oak trees, demolished the kind of health, wealth, and educational outcomes of the place. And so we built these things that told that story front and back, and we did them publicly, and we had a public conversation. And so this we're starting to see a little bit more of a spatial kind of condition. We are currently about to, there's a RFP that's been released to go after Lee Circle, which had the largest monument in New Orleans to a racist Confederate. And so what do we start to look like when we start to mass it? This is one step higher. This is Martin Luther King Junior Library in DC. We did an exhibition space there that started to take the symbol and the symbol of the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, and to create an exhibition that both reflected King's relationship to DC and the people's relationship to King in that space, especially around the change of policies, the marches, the protests that were happening. This is a project called Claiborne Innovation District. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that here shortly. Project called Launched out of New York. This is a environmental justice facility. Still raising money. Chuck Schumer owes us some money, but as soon as that gets set, we'll start construction on this as well. So I want to tell you about the two projects. This is Minden Library in Portland, Oregon. So this is the first project that we've been able to fully realize all of the strategies around design justice that we really wanted to realize. This is a library that we got a chance to hire 14 community design advocates. Ability focused, religion focused, racially, culturally, the whole gambit. We were able to bring people in. This is a very multicultural community. We hired people who spoke Russian. We hired some folks who were blind and deaf that kind of helped us with ability considerations, and they all became a part of the design team, right? And so they were out organizing their own communities. They essentially brought that feedback back to us. We translated it together, and we started to make some decisions. And so what happened, I think this is always a really nice situation. It's small, but it's the restrooms were one of the critical issues. The policy of the institution was to go non-gendered restrooms. That was the policy of the institution. Great. So that's the path we started down. So we started down that path. We started to talk to people, actually talk to people. And what we heard from religious communities or survivors of sexual abuse, they kept saying, great, I'm glad people have that, but we also want something else because that's not comfortable for us. And this is our library too. And so that easy, in the next phase, we were able to kind of shift and move stuff around and make sure that we kept the integrity of the building, but offered a different experience for those who were actively going to be harmed by that set of outcomes. This space is one of two libraries that we got a chance to work on in Portland, and both have that particular framework. We hired a ton of people to be a part of that process. We did engagement the entire time. We made newspapers usually as a means to kind of communicate with communities. So we hand out 5,000 to 10,000 newspapers per project, just so that folks get a chance to understand things in layman's terms throughout the process. So I wanted to talk to you lastly, this last 10 minutes about, so these are the story projects, three story projects. One is defrag. This is a house. These are projects about, the projects about displacement. So this one is about cultural displacement in the Treme. It is a series of pavilions, cultural museums in space. They're public. They allow us to have outdoor spaces in spaces and communities that are historically not getting the funding to consistently have spaces like this. And so this is one that's going up this summer. This is a bridge pass. It's about ecological and environmental displacement. This project is going up in conjunction with a mound, an indigenous mound that's being built just up the block. from what we call the Indigenous Collective. It's a group of Indigenous folk in New Orleans who are building a noun for the first time in 200, 300 years, right? In this place. And so this will tell a bit of the story of that. And then the last one is Cultural Futures Underneath the Bridge. This is the highway I mentioned earlier that cut through the Chimney. I have about 8 minutes on the power through this. And I just want to talk to you about process and outcomes. This process is a project that in, again, 1960, highway cut through, demolished, again, the health, wealth, educational outcomes of place. And in 1969, a group of individuals who were architects and designers and engineers and PhDs, they all came together and said, let's organize to create what they ended up calling the Claiborne Avenue Design Team. So the Claiborne Avenue Design Team was a group of organized individuals who made a 132-page document that described every bit of what they wanted to see changed in their community. It was a beautiful, beautiful document. It got disappeared pretty quickly after. It came back up. We picked up the document. There's probably only 30 or 40 out in the world. But we took that document and we did a lot of our own engagement, and it matched up with what they said 50 years ago. And so we started this process to basically build a connection point underneath the bridge between the two sides of the neighborhood that ended up being bifurcated. And so part of that was a slow process of engaging people around infrastructure, green infrastructure, around our elders and our elder community, around our artist community, a lot of our business folks, and then our young people were also a part of this process. They all got a chance to have a voice in the process. We collected nearly 20,000 comments over the course of this process. We themed them all, and we started to kind of create a series of designs that responded to that. So we wanted to, and I wanted to show you one thing on this real quick, because I think it speaks to something small, but I think important as well. In New Orleans and across the country, really, Black and brown businesses are 95% of Black and brown businesses will have 1 to 2 people the entirety of their existence. So they're not even small businesses, they are beta businesses. They're family businesses, right? And so they don't have the same access to capital as others. So putting them, and a lot of people tell us this, why don't you just put them in the shotgun houses that are derelict on the sides of the street? Smart idea. But as soon as you renovate those spaces, value goes up, the taxes go up, and they will be out of that building within 3 years, right? So you have to think about ways to create an architecture, a smaller architecture that allowed them to navigate that. And so we started to think about smaller ways to create expandable architecture that allowed for our community, our design community, to have spaces that they're not being imposed on their overall revenues. So again, small decisions, but the decision from trying to make these individuals fit into a system that they were never going to fit into was extremely important. And so we sketched, we talked, we did all of these things with community over the course of many years. And we got about $4 million in total over the last few years to build the first phase. One of the things about community work, and I oftentimes try to be clear about this, it takes a lot longer. We don't necessarily have easy access to the capital, so we oftentimes have to go slow and we have to build it with our own money, right, and our own efforts. And so that's where we are. We're in a space where we're actually seeing a lot of this start to take place and manifest in the underneath the highway over the course of the next 2 years. We're currently in a process where we will have 2 blocks of this done by Super Bowl next year in New Orleans. So you make it, probably not come to the Super Bowl, got it. But if you make it after or around, you come to Mardi Gras, I'll show you around. Okay. Lastly, I just repeat this at the end of most of my lectures, but language is important because design is a language, and design, like all languages, allows us to tell a story. stories are important because buildings tell our stories, and diverse stories, cultural stories come from diverse cultures. Culture is important, and culture is the consequence of persistent circumstance and immediate conditions. So our cities, our neighborhoods, our blocks incubate this culture, and for people of culture in America, there's power in the places and spaces where our culture is recognized, where our stories are told, and where our language is out. It's not just good design, that is design justice. So thank you so much for your attention. And yeah.
Great, well, we have about 10 minutes here before studio starts. Please stay if you can for some Q&A. And first I have a question. How many of you, how many students, how many of you found this inspiring? All right. Excellent.
You kind of put them on the spot.
Advertising for a position right now. But that's not really what I want to ask. What I ask is because I've done a little bit of community engagement work in my practice, and I know, and I tell my students, this is not work that happens Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. How, and I hear, from students talking about work-life balance. And let's start off with, how do you address that in your practice?
Yeah, work-life balance is obviously tremendous. So I think part of it is that when you are able to trust and offload the engagement to communities who are already doing it. I mean, I think that's the big thing, right? Like I'm in community, but I'm not in that neighborhood, and that neighborhood proper might have a different set of values or connections or whatever. And so we allow and trust our community design advocates and community design organizers to go out and say, look, here's what we're trying to do. Here's how we live in general, and how do we put it together. And so trusting other folks to do the job that we ask them to do is a big part of it. It's like release of ego, release of expectation, and taking that information however you can. That's the other thing is, especially when you're trying to engage with folks, you take the information however you get it. Sometimes people will write, sometimes people will talk, sometimes people will draw. However you get it, you get it. And so that's allowing them to do that is part of it as well.
All right. Well, I want to know, students have questions? I see a question.
Hello. Thank you, first of all, so much for being here. I really enjoyed all the things you talked about, especially the design and the things that we create tell stories. So how do you use your representation to make it aware to people's story that you like?
The architectural representation?
Yeah, like the bridge and everything like that. I don't know how you go about telling this.
Yeah. So there's a couple ways. We're pretty deliberate about it throughout our process, but we have 4 different design tools that we use. The first, we do a thing called baseline ground setting. And baseline ground setting allows us to take the kind of sociocultural, sociopolitical background and history of a place, both the recorded history and the people's history, and put that in document. It gives us a sense of who we should talk to, what people hate each other, what people like each other, that type of stuff. And then the geospatial parameters. So like what highway was there, or what bridge was there, or tracks, the other side of the track is always the big house, right? Those types of things allow us to understand a place first and foremost. So telling that story and making sure that is live, not just for us, but for everybody on a project and the community to kind of be reflected in as well. That's first. Second thing we do is we do a thing called the spatial implications report. So spatial implications really take on about 4 or 5 things. It's architectural, policy, procedural. So we tell clients precisely how the things that we heard impact their procedures and their policies. And then it allows us to translate what we heard into the spatial narrative, right? So it allows us to take the words out of people's mouths, understand the experience that they're aiming for as a byproduct of that, and then put that. We do all the same standard iterations, but let's see if I can get back. You saw one of these renderings that showed this. So we annotate a lot of our renderings. So we talk about what people wanted to see, and we start to kind of do that. And the last thing I'll say is that we create a design justice document set. So part of every document set that we do, we take the words, the inspiration from communities, and we annotate every decision that we made architecturally into the document. So every gesture, where it came from, what's valuable, what's not. So that's part of how the story gets infused, and we're held accountable ourselves, and we hold our clients accountable to it.
Talk about the economic parts that we focus on, whether it's developer side or
Yeah. We don't work with developers, mostly, but we are a nonprofit design justice practice. So part of being a nonprofit was for us to be able to go find funds and allow those funds to be directly distributed back into community savings. So we try our best to avoid things that are going to fall into the trap that developers usually have, right? So the return on investment trap that cycles and makes things harder to actually do good for. So that would be the first thing. So we take philanthropic money and do that. We also increase our rates on our standard projects and redistribute those funds back to community. Right? So we reduce our value, our overall fee to make sure that it can be accessible to other communities. And then I think the biggest thing that we are kind of working to do is to change policies and procedures that allow for the value and assets that people do have in community to be utilized in real ways, right? Because if I can't change how much money you have, then I need to be able to change the playing field so that you can use the assets that you do have as value, right? So that's a big part of it, right? So if you can use your space in a different way, you can, quarter off some of your spaces and let other people rent those spaces. Those are all parts of our strategy, but you create spaces that allow for that to happen and then change the policy accordingly.
There's a question in the back.
Hi, so my question is about the paper monuments project. That was seen at the studio project that then came to life. I'm curious about, so seeing it showed up in public spaces, were there permissions that you needed to get for that, or was it kind of for lack of a better term, self-started, self-funded project and y'all fixed fences that worked, or were you about to make like a public space, or was there like a collaboration between those spaces that you specifically picked that we own into those spaces, or kind of like other spaces?
Those are our spaces, so we took them. We went and we based it where we wanted to, and really the point was to repaste or post where the events happen, right? Like this is a thing. What's so beautiful about it, I didn't get a chance to talk about it, the Zaya project, there was a kid who was 11 years old in 1970, who was there at that event. He was a downtown district street sweeper. So every day on his lunch, he saw it the first time he saw it, and it was like, oh my God, I was there. He told the whole story. And so every day during his lunch, he would stand out there and teach anybody who got off at the bus and talk to him about this, right? So I think for us that's the purpose, to get people in conversation. That project was self-started. We ended up getting some philanthropic dollars once we had already done a few months of it and were broke. And then it rolled downhill. We ended up getting enough to be able to support. A community then started to support the overall effort. And it changed a lot, right? I mean, I think for a small project, the city removed 4 Confederate monuments. That was part of the purpose, is to reframe what monumentality looked like. We changed 20 or 30 street signs, like names. And not that these are big, great things, but they are small steps. And all of that rounded out to last week, we got an RFP to, again, take down, redesign the oldest, most racist statue in the middle of our city. Not actually, it's the second most racist. I know, that's weird, right?
Other question. I have a question.
Yeah.
Oh, no, here's a question. I have a question about the more federal program. How do you the process of the champion being federality and value over the quality of the space or having it still be represented?
Yeah. Well, the way that we always talk about it is that, like any relationship, you are building trust over time. And so you may, but usually people don't just jump in and get married on the second date, right? Again, you may do that. But the intention is to build slowly, is to build relationships. And part of building relationships means that you have to have dialogue at smaller levels, and to prove that you are going to do what you said you're going to do. And so I can't promise that on a $36 million project that gets dropped in the neighborhood and they have no commentary. And, but I can't promise it if we are talking to you and wanting and showing you that, reflecting that, what the community is. I can say that, right? And so that's what the ephemerality does. It builds trust. And then when we go back and we say, okay, well, we found or we got, or there is $10 million to do this project, people now trust us enough to allow us to kind of do it in a way that supports the community. So that's the reason we do things in that particular way.
How do you build trust like that in neighborhoods where you have less, like, obviously you're from New Orleans. So.
I'm from Jersey.
Oh,
but I've been there for 15 years, right?
Okay,
Yeah.
so like you have a trust in the neighborhood, you have like a standing. So how do you do that if you're newer?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is shut up, listen, be in places where people are, right? Humble yourself. Like a lot of times people will come in, and especially in New Orleans, I know we hate this, but people would come in after Katrina and just say, well, I know what's best for you. This is how you should do these things because we do it this way, right? And that is annoying, first of all, but it is also a thing that negates the kind of history of place that is the wisdom that people in New Orleans already have. So I think part of it is just listen, be a part of the community, build relationships that are not transactional. Like that is huge. Everything can't be I saw you here. Let's meet up and talk about this project. No, it can just be like, how's your mother doing? How you feeling? Like that's part of it. So that's really what I would say is the biggest thing is just try non-transactional engagements and build the trust that way.
Can I ask I want to ask a follow-up to that is,
Sure.
I find like probably the biggest problem, the biggest challenge in community work is fear of change. Mm-hmm. And you're talking about radical change. I mean, sometimes it hopefully doesn't feel it, but how do you address that when you're working with communities? What are your strategies when people just come and anything you say is change and well, I'm doing the way I'm doing it. And,
yeah. Usually those voices are the loudest and the smallest number. And so talk to more people. So that's really what we do. We outweigh them. Like oftentimes, and that's the beauty of being able to like still show that voice. Like that voice is there. The highway project, there is 12 people who want to keep that project, like to take the highway all the way down. Right? They're advocating for that. And we also want to eventually do it, but it's going to cost us $500 billion. We don't have that. And so do we not do something in the meantime? So what we did was we talked to thousands and thousands and thousands of people over the course of 10 years or 5 years. And those 12 people, while their voice is heard, there are more people who are saying something different. So
thank you so much.